Welcome to the Global Missions Podcast, a show for Christ followers who want to participate more effectively in God's work both at home and to the ends of the earth. Visit us at globalmissionspodcast.com to find show notes, resources, and previous episodes. You can also follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. And now, here's your host, Rob Magwood, better known to many friends as Mags.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to this episode. From time to time on the Global Missions Podcast, we've highlighted certain geographic regions of the world. Last season, for example, we highlighted Europe, and back in season 4, we went to Central Asia and to Latin America. Today, we're going to the Middle East. Our guest will share a bit about what the church looks like there today, and he'll share how North American believers can partner with these churches in the Middle East to help make disciples. Our guest today is Pierre Houssney, a Lebanese American who grew up in the context of cross-cultural ministry among Muslims and international students. For over 15 years, Pierre has served with Horizons International and helps lead a team of nationals and missionaries who run centers for evangelism and discipleship in several Middle Eastern countries. He has also co-edited the book Engaging Islam, and played a lead role in the development and teaching of the Engaging Islam curriculum. He's fluent in English and Arabic and teaches Arab and Western Christians for effective ministry to Muslims. He and his wife Gigi and their 3 children live in Beirut, Lebanon. Pierre, welcome to the program.
Thank you so much for having me.
Pierre, I'd just like to begin by asking you how you came to be involved and how you came to be passionate about helping both Arab and Western Christians minister to Muslims.
Yeah, that's a great question to start off here. And I think for me personally, just part of who I am, being Arab American, Lebanese American, my father's Lebanese, my mother's American. I grew up in Colorado. And so a lot of people, when they meet me, they say, "Oh, well, you don't have an accent." Well, yeah, because, I basically grew up as an American boy, knowing that I have a Lebanese background. I never really learned to speak Arabic growing up, but I always had a great love for Lebanon and would hear the stories from my father. And then we started being able to visit Lebanon when I was a teenager. And, my love for Lebanon grew. And then just in 2008, I really had this undeniable calling that I just have to be in Lebanon. God just put that on my heart. And I really had no clue what he had prepared for me, but I've become really addicted to empowering the national church in Lebanon and just seeing the Lord place me kind of in a place of a lot of action, where a lot of ministry centers, just since 2012, when we started our first ministry center, one thing has led to another. And it's been amazing to see. I think now we're operating like 9 ministry centers in the region, and we've got a school for refugee kids and a media thing. And I really don't know how this all happened, but I praise God that he's used me kind of as a bridge between the West and the Middle East. Kind of these 2 parts of who I am have been coming together in the way that I serve.
Well, I really appreciate you serving as that bridge, and for us today, just to help us learn and better understand how the Lord is at work in that part of the world, and specifically through Horizons. Would you take us to a high-level sketch then, an overview of what the church is like now in the Middle East, and maybe particularly in Lebanon?
Sure, yeah. So to focus on Lebanon first, okay, we could say Lebanese people around the world, because there's a huge diaspora of Lebanese people. You, Mags, you grew up with a friend who is Lebanese right next door to you, right? And so the number of Lebanese people that are outside of Lebanon is greater than that is inside. And probably about 50% or more of the global Lebanese population are Christian. But that could mean Maronite, Catholic, and Orthodox, and then small evangelical minority. But inside Lebanon, it's about 1/3 Christian ethnically. And then there is a small also evangelical minority. And so the churches, there's 103 official registered evangelical churches, plus a handful, maybe 15 or 20 ministries that are still kind of developing toward being registered churches. And there's 14 evangelical denominations represented. Probably the average attendance of these churches between 40 people to 100. There are some that are up to maybe 200, 250 or more. Most of the pastors are bivocational, so they're not full-time or not supported by the church. There are really few additional church staff, to speak of, except for kind of the larger, more well-funded and Western-connected churches. But it's awesome because that population of churches is just, it's there. Often people don't know, globally, they don't know how robust of an evangelical church there is in Lebanon. And then also in other Middle Eastern countries like Jordan, there are, a good number of churches. In Egypt, there's 10 million Christians. And so they have the biggest number, but definitely Lebanon has the biggest proportion of churches, per capita.
Well, I wonder, as we talk a little more about the church, what are some of the encouraging things that you see happening in and through the church in the Middle East?
One of the most encouraging things I would say is that there has really been an opening of the churches toward Muslims in the past, specifically decade. When my father was young and in the church, he was really among the minority of Christians that were even willing to share the gospel with Muslims. There was a lot of ethnic hatred, which there still is today, but there was a general feeling and a belief among Christians that Muslims could not come to faith in Christ. It was like the gospel was for Christians. And in the early days of the evangelical church, which has been around, I guess, 150 years plus in Lebanon, most of the people that came to Christ were from Orthodox background or Maronite Catholic background with, you'd hear here and there scattered stories and rumors of one or two Muslims who would come to faith in Christ. But there was a lot of suspicion that could actually happen. And the first person that my dad brought to the Lord from a Muslim background was actually rejected by my dad's church. And that was very sad. But the exciting thing is that now it's become undeniable that Muslims actually do come to faith, and they're flooding into the churches, especially Syrian refugees are flooding into the evangelical churches for the past 10 years. And we've seen thousands come to faith just through our ministry centers alone, and more are coming to faith through other ministries. And there are some evangelical churches in Lebanon that are now majority Muslim background churches just in the last 10 years.
Oh, very encouraging to hear that and just to understand it a little better, the development and the openness of God's people. I hope we'll say the same about the Western church as well, as we have more and more Muslim peoples among us in the West. I also just want to go to a specific event. We're recording this in November of 2020, and a few weeks ago, there was a very serious explosion in the Beirut harbor. And one of the things you were encouraged by before we started recording, you shared this, is just the response of God's people in that situation. Can you just speak to that a little?
When the explosion happened on August 4th, 2020, it was third behind Hiroshima and Nagasaki for size of explosion in a populated area. So we cannot understate how seismic that event was. In that time, the church really hit the streets and started serving the people. And that really made me so proud of God's people. And so many different churches hit the ground doing outreach. We, as an organization, we do a lot of humanitarian aid distribution through the churches. So we put in their hands sandwiches and food portions and bottles of water. And they all put on T-shirts that said "Jesus is with you" in Arabic, Yasua Haddak, on the front of their T-shirts. And we went down, and we had 80 staff and 40 extra volunteers from our partner churches in that blast radius. We had 3 relief tents set up, and we just saw many other churches do their own outreaches, and we've helped with resourcing them. It was so exciting to just see the spiritual openness of the people that had now lost their hope. The church has stood up and gone to the center and put their lives on the line in the middle of a pandemic. We've had over 30 of our staff catch COVID because of these outreaches, and they've known what they're doing. They're going in to be Christ's hands and feet and mouth in the time of need.
I appreciate you sharing some of the in-person or at least directly connected experience of the church in that crisis. I'd like you also to share with us just some of the challenges that you see the church in the Middle East facing in these days. We are recording it in COVID days, so that we just acknowledge the unusualness of 2020 anyway, and you could speak to that. But what are the other challenges that the church faces in that particular context?
Yeah, I mean, we're really describing what's happening in Lebanon as a triple crisis. So there's the political economic crisis, the COVID crisis, and then this explosion. We've seen a lot of brain drain happen in Lebanon, meaning that the best and brightest, as soon as they can get an opportunity to get out of Lebanon, they often take that chance. And even a lot of the people now that are so stalwart that they want to stick around in their country and they want to rebuild and they want to see good things happen. A lot of those are losing hope. And even now, a lot of people in the past few months have gotten on rubber dinghies and tried to get to Cyprus and have drowned on the way. People are so desperate right now. And for me, the church, it's like Lebanon is drowning. And the church has these little outposts and they're trying to hang on for dear life. A lot of the churches have their youth and their young people and their tithers really trying to get out of the country or tempted to get out of the country. So right now for us, when we're providing this humanitarian aid, encouragement, working with these churches, for me, I see it as a historic opportunity to basically put sandbags around these churches as everything else around them is eroding. Because history shows us that once the Christians leave and emigrate and find other places to live their lives in Canada or Europe or Australia or wherever they go, they don't come back. Outliers like me, I came back to my country, Lebanon, to serve, but that's the exception. That's not the rule. So for us right now, it's a historic opportunity to shore up these churches, to resource them, to give them ministry opportunities, and to stand by them so that they can maintain their presence and activities in the Middle East at a time when God is just leading millions of Muslims to Christ in the region. I don't see any more strategic missions effort than supporting the pre-existing evangelical Christians that are holding out right now in Lebanon.
I appreciate the snapshot, if you will, of Lebanon in particular. Is it similar, or how is it similar or different from the challenges in other Middle Eastern countries?
There are parallel situations happening everywhere. Jordan, in Iraq. Iraq has already lost because of, unfortunately, the wars, in the past 20 years. Iraq has lost most of its significant Christian population of Chaldean and Assyrian Christians. And there are also holdout churches that are there serving in Iraq and trying to hold out in difficult circumstances. Same with Syria. Generations of leaders have, sometimes the pastors have been able to emigrate and they left it to the second string pastor. And then the second string pastor made it out and then they left it to the third string pastor. And so we've seen a lot of believers rise up and take the reins of the leadership, step up, learn how to preach and lead the church. But these similar situations are happening in different places. And we're seeing a demographic shift where the church is becoming more Muslim background than ever before. And it's really exciting. And at the same time, this is a very strategic time to shore up these structures that God has put in place and invest where God has been investing so that the future can have healthy discipleship of this new generation of Muslim converts.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's really helpful. And I just want to emphasize too, you used a term which was fine, structure. We're not talking about physical structures of churches here. We're talking about the form of God's kingdom as it exists on the ground there. I just appreciate your vision to be equipping God's people. I think of 2 Timothy 2 and equipping God's people so that they can faithfully pass it on to others. Really, that's at the core of your vision, is it not?
Absolutely. Yeah, it's what you've heard in the presence of many witnesses, going down to that fourth generation, and trusting it to faithful men and women that can continue to teach. And so that's why we've established in Lebanon, in 2019, we established the Middle East Center for World Missions. And that's really kind of our flagship project because we really see Lebanon and Beirut in particular as the new Antioch for the church of today.
Well, there's a great strategy in that, of course. I'd like to turn our conversation. I'm tempted to go deeper into some of these things, but I want to turn the conversation to relate it to where most of our listeners are from, and they're somewhere in the West. How can the Western church work together helpfully in these days? And here I'm inviting you to inform us because we have a lot of good intentions. I want to acknowledge that even many of our listeners will be well intended, but we want it to be informed as well. So how can we from the West work helpfully together with the church in the Middle East at this time?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of opportunities to do that. And I think technology has really lended us more opportunities. I think in the past, you can see from some of the epistles that sometimes churches that are better resourced in one area will have sent, a delegation of Paul with some brothers to bring material resources to a church that's in duress, a strategic place, or a place that has famine. I believe that in these days, there's so much more of an opportunity to help out beyond just finances. Now, I still think nothing has changed in the 2000 years. There still is a need for financial help for the church in certain areas by the brothers and sisters in other areas that are better resourced. But also we've seen that virtual means and just the transportation, modern transportation has made it possible to connect across the sea. And through Zoom this year, we've seen a lot of church partnerships form and a lot of people be able to be encouragement to local churches and ministries. And so, yeah, I think the secret lies in relationships. And many have said that ministry moves at the speed of relationships.
We want to acknowledge what you just emphasized at the end is that really it is relationships, right? And establishing healthy relationships. I wonder where you see particular opportunities at the moment. What are the bright spots for opportunities where far away Christ followers can partner together with the church in the Middle East?
Yeah, well, I want to just start with acknowledging that it's been a really hard year for missions programs in the US at churches. There's a lot of people that want to make a difference. There are a lot of people that are giving sacrificially, but they have really felt like their wings are clipped because, okay, we had this mission trip scheduled and we couldn't do it because of COVID. All of our mission stuff, basically, we couldn't do because of COVID, except for we can do wire transfers and support, our partners. That's great. But one of the felt needs is like, how do we still have this genuine connection, which is so important for a missions department? And so the thing that we've come up with are virtual vision trips. And so what we have been doing is we've been facilitating a lot of different calls via Zoom, connecting some of our church partners and our staff members in Lebanon, particularly with churches in the West and even in Hong Kong. We have a network and an office in Hong Kong. And so we've had prayer meetings that are across between Hong Kong and Beirut, prayer meetings with churches in the United States and some of our sister or partner churches in Lebanon. And so opening up those connections makes it almost just like as if you had gotten on a plane and come and are visiting. These are the relationships that form usually on a short-term mission trip. But we've been actually able to see the relationships deepen even more because now we are bound by space, but we're not as bound by time. Because the short-term mission trips, it would be you come for a few days and then you have to go. And usually people don't form those connections online as much. But now, because of the limitations, those relationships have gone on, and they usually start at these virtual vision trips.
Oh, it's a great idea for those in our audience who might have considered an in-person trip. You hear the clear idea that some of that value can be accomplished, I'll say remotely, using technology. Not all of it, we would grant. However, there are some bonuses or some very bright spots to that as well. Long-term partnerships can be strengthened through this. And I would want to submit the idea, I guess, that maybe a long-term ship relationship that normally would begin with an in-person trip could be begun through a remote relationship and like a vision trip that Pierre is talking about.
Yeah, I think that establishing that relationship virtually before a trip can actually add value to your trip so that you're actually, you feel like you're reuniting with somebody that you already know when you go on that trip rather than establishing an acquaintance once you go.
Very helpful ideas that I hope will be accessible to many hearing this. Pierre, you have emphasized in different ways the potential of near culture ministry. What do you mean by near culture?
Sure. So, near culture is what we talk about when we're referring to a missionary that is going to a context that's similar to his own culture. So, when we talk about in the Middle East near culture missionaries, we're primarily talking about Lebanese missionaries or Syrians that are going to Morocco or to Egypt or to Tunisia. And so, when they go to Tunisia, it's so much easier for them to begin to operate in that area. So they do have to learn a new dialect of Arabic, but a lot of Tunisians already understand Lebanese dialect, Lebanese Arabic. So when you speak, people actually in Tunisia, last time I was in Tunisia, somebody actually said, "Oh, I love your accent. Keep talking. I don't care what you say. Just talk, just speak because I love that cool Lebanese accent." So it's like an Australian that comes and, "Oh, can you speak Australian?" Or whatever it is.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was thinking, actually. We sometimes joke that a speaker from Australia gets a 15% head start because everybody's just fascinated by the accent.
Exactly. So they can say whatever they want. And in these contexts, you can start speaking about Jesus, and people are just excited to hear. And then also, some of the advantages are, they know how to operate, they know how to deal with the Arabic culture. The language, as I said, is easier, but then also they know how to save money and go on the cheap. So the ministry expenses are much lower. And then also the perception of the nationals, of the indigenous people, to a near culture people is totally different. So when an American comes to Tunisia, for example, and starts preaching the gospel, they're looked at as a Western agent and all of that. Whereas if someone's coming from Lebanon, it's more like already coming from our group of countries, which is the Arab League countries. So the strategic possibilities for near culture ministries are just off the charts.
Does this help us think about how Western missionaries do participate? In other words, is there still a role for North American churches to play in this whole ecosystem?
Absolutely, there's still a key role for Western missionaries. But like you said, this new opportunity just represents a changing dynamic. So we need to think about now, what is the role of the American missionary or the Western missionary? And so when a Western missionary comes in, I think in the past or in some contexts still today, the Western missionary needs to be the boots on the ground, where they're the ones that are day to day preaching the gospel and doing it from ground zero. But in this day and age, when there are existing local churches, already in place, the role of the Western missionary, in my opinion, should really be in trying to multiply that calling. So let's say the Western missionary really has a heart for Muslims. They want to carry out their calling to reach Muslims. So what I believe is that the most effective way to do that is to sow that into the nationals, the indigenous churches, because the indigenous churches actually have a higher capacity to do that ministry, but they may not have the vision to do that. So the unique puzzle work of the needs and abilities on one side with the needs and abilities on the other side can really be impactful.
Well, you're really talking about a very intentional strategic integration here of the body of Christ and bringing what would be the best strengths to leverage from the West with whatever context they might be serving in. Then I love that idea of multiplying the capacity of national Christ followers. That's a terrific example. I wonder whether you have an example you could share with us, Pierre, about a healthy kingdom partnership that you've seen between a church, for example, in North America and a church in the Middle East.
Yeah, there are a lot of examples of that. Before I answer that question, I just want to say that my observation of the missions endeavors that are commonly had is that there are two different categories. So, one kind of organization sends Western missionaries, and another kind of organization will support national workers. But the problem is that often, though, they're operating in the silos. So, in terms of a successful model, we have been working hard to forge partnerships, kind of sister church relationships between Western churches and churches in the Middle East. And one that recently happened in 2020 is a church toward the north of Lebanon with a church in the US. And it's just been awesome just to see the relationships form And then also they've been able to partner on a financial level. They've been able to partner on a training level so that they're both learning from each other and they're actually both putting skin in the game. They're both investing financially. So they've done kind of like matching grant type collaboration where the Lebanese church is taking part in their own relief effort for the crises in Lebanon. And then the US church is also throwing resources in the hat so that they can even do more. So I think that's a really successful model.
Yeah, and that is so helpful to mention. I'm glad you mentioned finances, Pierre, because it does come into the question often. In the West, very often, not always, but we're from higher GDP countries, and financially, we have resources to bring. And it may be that the local church of national believers has other resources to bring. And we need to really watch. I mean, obviously, with care, we have interviewed how we can help without hurting the authors of that great book. But there are different capacities that we have, and some of that from the West may be generosity with financial resources to fuel and to catalyze other activity. So it doesn't need to be a 50-50, right? We're not talking about keeping this exactly even necessarily.
No, I think we should optimize it for the situation. And I think, unfortunately, things go one way or the other. Sometimes Western churches think that they can just check off their Great Commission box by writing a big fat check. And unfortunately, sometimes they don't provide the accountability to make sure that those funds are going to be spent in the right way. Sometimes they're given out of trust, and sometimes that trust is misused because of the way that it's been set up, where even the national church or the indigenous church, they view the Western partner as, oh, they give us the money, we do the ministry, that's it. And I think that there's so much wrong with that. But also, I think we can't over spiritualize things and say that resources are not what partnership should be about, meaning financial resources. Because I've also seen bad situations on the other side where it almost feels like exploitation for the nationals, which is a strong word, but it's like sometimes missionaries or churches will come over and they will use the ministry on the ground as kind of like a touring facility for their short-term mission trip, which is maybe more like glorified tourism. So they get to go and they want to see all the ministry and they want to serve by praying and encouraging. And then they go home having not really added value to the field ministry, and they can give their report on their mission trip and said, we did these wonderful things, and maybe they spent $15,000 on plane tickets and accommodations and all that. They wasted the time of the national church on the ground. Maybe they felt encouraged initially, but then maybe they felt discouraged because really it did not help them move the ball forward in their ministry. So I think that the key is optimizing and just following the Spirit and using our common sense in saying, okay, if I'm going to take this trip with 10 people from my church, maybe I should cut it down to 5 people. And the rest of that, we're going to just give to bless the local church. And then not only make it a financial relationship, but make it also a two-way discipleship relationship where there's learning on both sides.
In a moment, we're going to ask Pierre to share some resources for North American churches and some practical steps they can take. He'll also share a closing word with missions committees. Just before we get to that part of the conversation, we'd like to share with you this mission resource that we hope will be helpful to you and your church.
Are you looking to help your church become more effective in global missions? CatalystServices.org is a place where churches can find excellent resources, ideas, and training opportunities. Sign up for Postings, a monthly e-newsletter filled with practical advice and tools to help churches in their global missions engagement. You can listen to a conversation with Ellen Livingood, the founder of Catalyst Services, right here on the podcast. Check out episode 106, called Engaging Your Church's Untapped Missions Potential. And now, back to today's conversation.
We're back with Pierre Houssney of Horizons International, talking about North American churches partnering effectively with churches in the Middle East. If a group would like to take a first step, Pierre, what would you recommend they consider first?
2020 has really been presenting a lot of different challenges. And I think for the missions committee, one of the biggest challenges is just feeling grounded, feeling like there's nothing you can do right now. You may have had trips on the schedule that you had to cancel. So really for me, I feel that the easiest first step right now is to participate in one of our virtual vision trips. And the virtual vision trips basically get you connected on the ground with the Syrian and Lebanese staff members that are running the ministries on the ground in Lebanon. And it's a wonderful way to just make relationships. Just like if you had gotten on an airplane and gone to Lebanon and stayed there, you'd find yourself on, at 9 a.m. on your first day, you'd find yourself in an office sitting there with some of our field leaders. And these virtual vision trips, actually, we provide some video where we show the facilities of the ministry and we show some of the ministry programs in action. And then you actually get a chance to interact live with the ministry leaders and the people that are serving on the ground to ask questions and get to know them personally. And so to me, it's really gaining a lot of the value of an actual mission trip in person, but it's just happening on a very convenient virtual platform.
Well, Pierre, if any of our listeners would like to learn more about this topic, about relating to the church in the Near East, what resources do you have to recommend?
I think probably the best first step to take would be to take the Engage course. So we have a course called Engage Muslims with Christ, and it has a lot of the foundational principles for how to start speaking with Muslims. And I think it's really the prerequisite, in a way, to learning how to interact with nationals as well. So you can find that course at engagingislam.org. We do have it now in an online format. And then we also have additional training that goes deeper for people that are interested in long-term service among Muslims, which is called the Engaging Islam Academy. And so that's a really wonderful place. Both of those are online, and those are wonderful places to start.
Super. Before we get to one of my favorite final questions, we'll just ask if any of our listeners would like to reach out to you to follow up on this conversation, Pierre, how could they do that?
Sure. They can just email me personally at pierre@horizonsinternational.org. And if they are interested in the virtual trips, then they can just reach out to our international teams department by sending an email to trips@horizonsinternational.org.
Very good. And we will include all of these links in the show notes. Our regular listeners will know that. If you're new, you can find them at globalmissionspodcast.com. Pierre, just as we finish today, a question I like to ask has to do with missions committees. Maybe if you can imagine a missions committee or group of them together and pastors of a local church, they want to do missions really well. And they're hearing you speak today. What would you like to say to that group?
I would just say that today is a new day in missions, even though it sometimes at this time feels like there aren't a lot of opportunities. Sometimes those limitations can actually open up new opportunities. So I personally would love to help just even brainstorm about what those opportunities are and just kind of give any insight that I have from the Middle East in terms of the opportunities that are happening right now, because they are numerous, but it's also becoming challenging without the ability to visit. So that just for me underscores the fact that you really need to take initiative to contact partners on the ground and be having conversations with them online, since that is possible now. And it's even culturally acceptable as more and more people are accepting the idea of communicating via internet. So I would just say, take the opportunity to deepen the relationships using virtual means at this time. And that can really lead to partnerships that last for years.
Sure. Well, Pierre, thank you so much for joining us today and for sharing some of your experience in the Middle East and about Horizons International. May the Lord bless you.
Thank you so much for having me.
As we finish up today, we want to mention an episode related to today's topic. We've chosen number 20, entitled Doing Cross-Cultural Partnerships Well with Mary Lederleitner. It's way back in season 1, and she unpacks some great, helpful principles. There are also several episodes related to the topic of Islam. If you visit the homepage, globalmissionspodcast.com, you will find there a filter that you can use. If you roll down to Islam, it will provide several relevant episodes for you. Today's episode is brought to you by the Global Missions Toolbox and produced by Send International in collaboration with other like-minded agencies. Please take a moment to subscribe, and we'd be grateful if you take just a minute and leave us a review. On behalf of our team, thanks for listening. Join us again in 2 weeks when we'll continue to explore this grand adventure of being Christ's witnesses to the ends of the earth.